treatment of these messages, except that once I received an extraordinarily long one. Generally, they ran 30 or 40 words. But this ran well over 100 words, and I was very curious to find out what it was. He broke down and told me that I would see all about it in a few weeks in the papers, and of course it was about the coming sailing of Exodus 47, which was then being prepared for its now historically recorded trip from southern France to Palestine, back to Hamburg.
All this code broadcasting was against amateur radio regulations. The reckoning came suddenly. Herman Gross tells about it.
One night in September of 47, after several hours of transmission, Rube went back to his house. I happened to be on the phone with him. We were talking over the events of the evening. And suddenly Rube says, "Hold on, excuse me, I got someone at the front door." I didn't think much of it at the moment, but then he came back to the phone breathlessly saying, "Sorry, I got to hang up now." Bang, and he hangs up the phone very abruptly. That in itself was odd. I, again, didn't think much of it. No more than 30 seconds after he hung up, my front doorbell rang. And I go to the front door, and 3 men are standing there in the dark, and they flash identification badges, and they identify themselves very properly. Turns out 2 of them are FBI men, 1 was an FCC man. They asked permission to come in, which was proper legally, and of course I invited them in. They asked me whether I had a radio station, which of course was obvious. I had a huge antenna sticking up from the roof. I couldn't miss it. And I said yes. They said, "May they see it?" I said yes. I showed them into the station room, and the first thing they do is go behind the back of the station, and they put their hands on the tubes to see if they're hot, and of course they were still hot. And they said, "Where were you transmitting logs?" And of course my logs were all wrong. I said I wasn't transmitting, my brother was. Where was he transmitting to? I don't know. So for about a half an hour we bantered back and forth, and I claimed that I knew nothing whatsoever about it. And I didn't feel so good, and I can tell you that when a couple of FBI men come into your house for any reason whatsoever, you don't feel so good. I tried to throw them onto the fact that it had to do with Palestine, and so they didn't think they had a couple of Russian spies in their hands, because if you may recall, this was the time of the start of the Cold War. Winston Churchill had just made his Fulton, Missouri speech, and things were worsening between us and Russia. And the FBI, of course, was out looking for commie spies. I said, it has something to do with Palestine, that's all I know about. Anyhow, the thing broke up. They asked me to report to the office of the FBI in Foley Square the next morning. And they left. Needless to say, I was very apprehensive. And the FBI pays you a visit. You don't sleep that night. At about 6 o'clock, Rube came over. He didn't use the telephone. We confirmed exactly what had happened in each place. It was identical in his place. He, too, had been told to turn up at the office of the FBI and to make a full statement. We were not under arrest, of course. Rube got in contact with the Jewish agency immediately, told them exactly what had happened, that he could not handle any more messages, and told them where we were going, and is there anything they can do to help us. Well, as it turned out, they must have helped us. We learned later that some of our very high-placed friends were told to make an appropriate call in the proper place and to lay off. The results would certainly indicate that that was so, because when we went, the attitude was a very, very friendly one, an understanding one, and in effect we were said, don't do it again and forget it, which of course was a surprise to us and very pleasing. Well, as it turned out, Rube hadn't heard the end of it officially, because he had committed a whole series of breaches of FCC amateur regulations which couldn't go unpunished. Sending of code, sending of false identification, sending to a false identification, all of these were clear-cut violations of the amateur regs. We subsequently learned that the FCC had been monitoring us almost from the very beginning. The reason they were able to spot us from the outset was the fact that we were sending in code, and as you tune across the amateur bands, you hear the typical amateur communication, how's the weather, the handle here is Joe, and I'm running a 75A4 to a 3-element beam, and any other type of conversation just sticks out by its difference. And the only reason we were permitted to continue for 6 months is because they were trying to break the code. They felt that the more messages they had, the better opportunity they had to break the code. And if they did break it, they'd have that much more information. After 6 months, they gave up and finally closed in on us. We also subsequently learned that the code was never broken, which is probably one of the very rare times in FBI history that has happened. We were told that the code was one of the few unbreakable types of codes because it did not have a repetitive character. The code simply referred to pages, lines, and words in a particular line of a Hebrew book, one copy of which was here, one copy of which was in Tel Aviv. And to break it, you simply had to identify the word in the particular book, and you had the text. Since the words were not repetitive, there was no possible basis by which the code could be broken.
Reuben tells us what happened in his case.
Ultimately, my license was revoked by the Federal Communications Commission. On this, I requested hearings, and hearings were ultimately held, and the revocation was canceled. Instead, my license to operate was suspended for 6 months, part of which was retroactive for 2 months. And the commissioner, and this hearing was held by a commissioner, although almost all hearings before the Federal Communications Commission are held before trial examiners. This was considered to be of extraordinary importance that a commissioner was appointed. It was a Commissioner Sterling who was personally in charge of all counter-espionage in World War II for the United States. And at the conclusion of the hearings, and after having stepped off the bench, stepped back again and asked the stenographer to also record the following statement. He says, and we will also consider that people sometimes do things they would not ordinarily do when they are so deeply concerned with the welfare and life of their fellow men.
There is a sequel to the story. Herman Gross tells us about it.
Rube left shortly afterwards to join the Haganah, and he served in the Air Force there in the communications branch, and he did significant work for them. By the time he came back, his 6 months were more than up. Many years later, we got more interesting sidelights as to the other side of the operation. It turns out that the station was in an underground vault in what was then the outskirts of Tel Aviv. To get to it, you had to go into an adjacent building, go down into the basement. There was a little toilet. You sit on the toilet, you lift the paper roll, there's a key. Then you take the key and you go behind the toilet, and there's a little 3x3 panel which you can open the key. You crawl through it, you go through a tunnel, and you find another panel, and you repeat the operation. Then you come into the basement of the adjacent building, and into that basement there's a room which has no entrance from that building at all. And in that room, our friend sat and sent messages to us. My brother is now an Israeli, and he visited the place, and he says now there's nothing left there except a couple of conduits leading outside to the back of the building from which the power leads were run and the antenna leads were run. He's talked to the people who ran the operation. There are some very high-placed people there whose names I'm not at liberty to mention because they're doing very special work today. And they were instrumental in setting this up. As I say, Rube lives in Jerusalem. He now has an Israeli call, 4X4CY. I have a station here in my house here, and I talk to him every week, hour, 2 hours, very regularly. I phone patch him through to his family. He has several married sons that are living here. He talks to my mother, who's now 85. And it's been very nice that he's been able to go there with the unmarried portion of his family and his wife, and still be able to talk back to the part of the family that he's left here, and to my mother, who misses him, of course, but still gets the nachas of being able to hear his voice every week. And that's the story.